Yo, what's going on, everybody? Welcome to the third episode of Look Who's Chalking. We got 2 weeks in the books. Gary, what's going on? Let's say hello to everybody and then get right into things, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I don't mind, Eddie. That sounds fine to me. I'm doing well, man. Week 2 was interesting. There was a lot of chalk that busted. That's what we're here. We're here to kind of make our way through that chalk and figure out what we can learn from that week. But I'm really excited for week 3 here. Really excited just to kind of be more into the full swing of football season. And
we're supposed to be chalk busters, but unfortunately, maybe because it's early in the season, you became more of a chalk duster than a chalk buster. So usually this is where we typically would open up with, I'm sick. But since
I swear to God, I'm sick.
I'm not that sick, I'm pretty symptom free, unlike Antonio Brown today. But why don't you give us a mini synopsis of what upset your stomach if didn't give you the full virus, if you know what I'm talking about.
So, yeah, I mean, I obviously knew that the Cowboys-Chargers game had a chance of busting, and everyone probably should have known that. Any game that has a high over-under can always go the wrong way. And something that we've talked a lot about over the last year or so of doing this show is being contrarian from the field, not eating the chalk, figuring out places to get different. However, I always talk about there's times where, there is such a thing as good chalk, and I was really sure that game environment between the Chargers and the Cowboys was good chalk. I was obviously just wrong, and I still was comfortable with my process. I got contrarian within the chalky environment. I didn't even include Dak Prescott in my build. I thought, I'd rather just stick to one side of that coin, but I did go up to 30% Justin Herbert in my lineups, which obviously did not work out. Now,
for what it's worth, they had, I believe, 2 touchdowns taken back on taunting penalty.
Not only 2 touchdowns, I think they had 6 or 7 penalties that completely negated big positive impact plays, including 2 touchdowns. Maybe this is just my giant side coming out, but that game seemed completely rigged for Dallas from the ref standpoint. But irregardless, it doesn't make a difference. I missed on that one. Luckily, the rest of my build was pretty strong where I didn't have a disaster week. But of course, I am sick that game just not only did it not bust. I mean, it didn't come close to that 55-point over/under. It was sloppy second halves. The defenses probably came to play more than people would have thought. The refs got way too involved, and it was just it was an ugly game from a DFS perspective.
It was like Teddy KGB in Rounders, where he's like, I feel so unsatisfied because you saw the makings of a high-scoring game. You saw it. Like, they came out throwing. They were moving the ball. There were many deep balls. Not so much on Dallas's side, but it looked like a game with a ton of scoring. Now, it didn't really break a lot of my lineups because I didn't have, a different guy who you could say broke my lineups was the Roethlisberger double stack. But interestingly enough, none of them succumbed to the dreaded Draftkings snowflake, which is why I was about those cheap prices on them. I mean, look, I'm not proud of how it went down, but they didn't ruin my lineups. My lineups with them still cash because of good plays like both of our men's warehouse picks of the week.
Yep.
We had Mike Evans coming through with the 2 Paul O'Neill touchdowns, and I'm just going to leave it at that, all right? A different person would be patting themselves on the back for 6 straight weeks. This is my little mini celebration. And Zeke ended up having a good day, even though it was a little disconcerting to see all that Pollard use. But regardless, had close to 100 total yards and a touchdown. So Men's Warehouse dialed up some good fittings for us.
Yeah, the theories were right there with both of those picks, and obviously Zeke's day could have been a lot bigger. I think they're finally, and I mentioned this on the podcast while I was talking about my Men's Warehouse last week, that Pollard is the better player at this point. There's no doubt about it, and honestly, good on Dallas for having the balls to play him as much or more than Zeke, despite that Zeke contract, because that's what they should be doing. And obviously, that Dallas run game in general came through last week for sure.
And any takeaways looking back at the week in general, like, oh my God, how did I miss this? This is something that I'm so used to see. Just quickly, because I'm not all over the estimated projections. Like, how they vary from day to day. What I do is, before I finalize my lineups, I try to see what they are closest to game time so I know. And one of the lowest owned running backs as far as big names was Derrick Henry by a country mile.
Yep.
Now, in retrospect, do you say to yourself, God, he was that low just for the sheer sake of we know he could have a big game, I should have had him in more?
Yeah, and I debated it right at the end there. I'm like, we can get really contrarian here by throwing Derrick Henry in this build, at least at a real clip, and I just didn't pull the trigger. And what we're seeing out of Derrick Henry out of these first 2 weeks, and I want to say it's just an aberration for now because we haven't seen it for his entire career, but we're seeing him involved in the passing game, which just changes his floor completely. And yeah, no, I broke my own rule, man. Like my rule is I include anyone that can hit a certain ceiling, and obviously Derrick Henry can hit that on any given week. I should have been more involved there. However, listen, like Derrick Henry won people's slates and Cooper Kupp won people's slates, who was the chalkiest of receivers, right? So again, that's what I mean. There's times to eat the chalk. I went under on Woods because again, we talked about this on the podcast also. The smart play was going heavier on the Woods on the Woods exposure and less on the Kupp exposure because of ownership. And sometimes that'll come back to bite you, but it's still probably the right play. And I actually think it is once again this week when Kupp is again mega chalk. I think coming in through at 25% early ownership.
We're going to revisit that, and I'm going to give you a chance, from an inside, not an inside scoop, but an inside sniff from me about who that version of Derrick Henry would be this week. You said
I have some theories too.
Okay, cool. So then let's bring out the theories and start evaluating week 3 of DFS. I just like to look at it. I think this was a good analogy last week. I like to put on my regular guy hat. It's a blank hat that they would allow on reality TV shows because there are no logos. And a little inside tip, you can't have any logos on reality TV shows because they're so cheap that they won't pay for the rights to use them. So I'm going to put on my generic blue hat right now and look at the DFS board and say, oh, well, gee golly, let's build a lineup in that game. And number 1 has to be the Kansas City Chiefs hosting the LA San Diego Chargers. That has to be one of the games that's coming in at 55.5. But interestingly enough, neither of those two teams are in the top 5 in terms of team projected totals. So both of them have like relatively high totals, but neither of them has a crazy one. Like there are 5 other teams with higher team totals than they do, but collectively they're looking at a 55.5 over under. So when it comes to that game, from everything you saw last week, would this be a week where Herbert maybe screwed a couple people, but you saw how often he was chucking it, and you saw that it took calls to screw him out of a big day? You think Herbert might be a decent play here going into Kansas City?
I sure do. And I'm not going to be super confident on it where I'm going to go as heavy as I would have last week, but he'll certainly make my build once again. The biggest thing holding Herbert back this week is the tough crowd in Arrowhead. A young quarterback going on the road in one of the toughest environments, but everything else is in his favor. The Kansas City defense stinks. They're bad, and I don't know how bad yet, but I'm starting to think they're like bottom 5 bad. We'll find out as that kind of fleshes itself out more over the next couple of weeks. But we just saw what Baltimore did to them, completely light them up. We saw what Cleveland did to them, put up almost 30 points as well, or around 30 points in week 1. And I think that game script is really going to work in his favor here, where Kansas City should get up pretty, I would say pretty convincingly at a point. I think the spread's only within a touchdown or so, but I think at the very least the pace will be on, and Kansas City should hold the lead throughout, where he's going to have to keep his foot on the gas.
I believe it's 6.5 points. Yeah,
exactly. So it doesn't scare you too much. Where they're expecting this to be a somewhat competitive game.
One of the reasons that I like Herbert in this game and in general, they don't have a running game that can literally take the ball out of his hands. Like sometimes you get worried that if a running game's going well, maybe a quarterback won't be throwing it. They just don't even have that ability. They do not have a running back who they can hand the ball off to 16. So even in a game where they would be ahead, they would still be winging it. Like this guy is going to be winging it all year because their best running back is a guy who really is more about dump-offs than he is inside runs.
Well, their run game is dump-offs to Eckler, right? So that's why I like Eckler in the spot plenty, because I think that reception high is the reception floor is high. But on the flip side of that, though, you could say the same thing about the Chiefs. I think we're getting to the point where Clyde-Edwards Helaire, who we have to talk about because he's going to be mega chalk at a very, very, very low price, and I'm not interested. But it's the same thing. I don't think they have anyone that they could throw. They can just hand the ball to either. And Mahomes at home in a Chargers aren't our Chargers are somewhat of a tough matchup, but I think that Osmo has that top stack tool they're coming through as a 19.3% chance of being the top stack, where the next highest game, which is the Kyler Arizona game, at 9.6%. So it's literally 10% higher than the next, and you get crazy leverage on the field there because Mahomes is only coming through around 8% ownership right now. So I'm a fan of using both sides of this game, which a lot of the time I'll pick one side as far as a quarterback's game stack is concerned. But in this instance where the prices are so different between the two quarterbacks, and you can make an argument for game script on either side, I like both.
So Helaire will be super chalk, but I am not as iffy about it as you are, simply because I believe that there's going to be that instance of they know what happened. They know he lost the game on the fumble, but they also do know he has to be a part of this team. Without Sammy Watkins, I don't know if you've been noticing, they don't have a third guy who's catching balls. Like it is Hill, Kelsey, and then they're not finding a way to get Mecole Hardman involved, which is why he might be ultra chalk at like 3,900. But I know they have like Demarcus Robinson, but Sammy Watkins provided something to that team that they don't have anymore, which I think you're going to really see start to come bite them, in the rear end here, because it's Hill, Kelsey, and if Hilaire's not catching a bunch of passes out of the backfield, who else do they have?
Yeah, but we haven't seen Helaire really catch that many passes out of the backfield for any point of his career, nor have
Which
we seen
is
him
weird.
Nor have we just seen him be a very good running back yet. I mean, he just looks average at best. And Hartman, I'll give Hartman this. I mean, he did 8 targets last week. 5 for 55. I think with just the sample size is too small with this.
Right.
I do think we're going to see a kind of spread out targets between him, Robinson, and Pringle outside of with Hartman leading that group. But Hartman actually, I mean, I'm all over Hartman at 3,900 this week, especially if you're using Mahomes, because he's coming through right now early ownership at 7.7%. Let's say that bumps up to like 10 to 11%.
Yeah.
That's still fine because there's not that many great cheap receivers this week to me on the slate, and the couple guys that are pretty chalky. So
I'll tell you, I am going to be that fool. I could already see it. I'm going to have a Herbert stack because I'll go to Jared Cook, who didn't have a good week, and he'll probably, everyone was on him last week. Now I bet you they'll fade away from him and either use Allen or Williams. And I know myself, I'm not going to be able to stop myself from taking a 4,800 Helaire, who I haven't given up on as much as other people, and then the 3,900 Hardman. I could just see it right now.